So just a heads up, today's the third Sunday, so as usual we'll have an extended homily question and answer discussion. And to kind of counterbalance the difficulty of Jerry's reading, I decided to pick a very, very simple reading today. Now, over the years we've chosen readings from all kinds of sources, from all the scriptural traditions, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, from poetry, from novels. This may be the strangest reading you've ever heard on a Sunday morning. But I chose it because it leads into the homily. I'm going to talk about karma today. And I want to talk particularly about how solutions that we offer to previous small problems often create much bigger problems, or solutions are more problematic than actually the problems they were set out to address. So this is a very simple little reading. It's politically incorrect. It's a nursery rhyme, and most of you probably know it, and I'm not just going to read it, I'm going to sing it. And I'm going to invite all you to sing along with me. There was an old lady who swallowed a fly. I don't know why she swallowed a fly. Perhaps she'll die. I know an old lady who swallowed a spider that wiggled and jiggled and tickled inside her. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly, but I don't know why she swallowed the fly. Perhaps she'll die. I know an old lady who swallowed a bird. How absurd, to swallow a bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider that wriggled and jiggled and tickled inside her. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly, but I don't know why she swallowed the fly. Perhaps she'll die. I know an old lady who swallowed a cat. Fancy that, to swallow a cat. She swallowed the cat to catch the bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider that wiggled and jiggled and tickled inside her. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly, but I don't know why she swallowed the fly. Perhaps she'll die. I know an old lady who swallowed a dog. What a hog, to swallow a dog. She swallowed the dog to catch the cat. She swallowed the cat to catch the bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider that wiggled and jiggled and tickled inside her. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly, but I don't know why she swallowed the fly. Perhaps she'll die. There was an old lady who swallowed a cow. I don't know how she swallowed a cow. She swallowed the cow to catch the dog. She swallowed the dog to catch the cat. She swallowed the cat to catch the bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider that wriggled and jiggled and tickled inside her. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly, but I don't know why she swallowed the fly. Perhaps she'll die. I know an old lady who swallowed a horse. She's dead, of course. These are words inspired by an overactive imagination. Donal Crowley was the second most stubborn human being I've ever met in my life. He lived in the same park as we did, a project outside of Cork City called St. Joseph's Park. There were 34 houses in it. We lived in number 9, and Donal's family lived in number 22. And we were age mates. And we both went to school at a place called the North Mon. It was run by the Christian Brothers, and it was 3.5 miles away from where we lived, so we cycled to school every day. And Donal was a member of the Cub Scouts. Did you have Cub Scouts here? Okay. So he was never separated from a beanie. He had a little green beanie with golden braid on it, and he was never separated from his beanie. And we were in this school. It was a big, big school, and because we lived so far away, during lunch hour, most of the local kids could go home for lunch, but we didn't, so we'd bring a sandwich with us, typically bread and butter and jam sandwich, and a bottle of milk at recess, which went on for an hour and a half. And there was a big play yard there, a concrete play yard. And the school was built on a very steep hill. So on one side, there was a wall, which was about 4 feet high on our side, but when you climbed over it, there was an 8-foot drop into the other side, into the backyards of private individual houses. So during recess, we'd play hurling and football and soccer and rugby and every kind of game, and wrestling matches and whatever. So one day, Donal and myself are wrestling together during recess, and he's wearing his, ubiquitous beanie. So I grab the beanie and I throw it, and it goes like an aerobie, over the wall and down into the backyard, which was 8 feet down. And Donal says, "Go get it." He says, no, it's your beanie, you get it. She says, no, you get it, you threw it, I won't. And we're both trying to outdo each other. And at that stage, the bell goes, it's the end of recess. So we scramble back into school. So I'm presuming that at the end of school at 4 o'clock, Donal will climb over the wall and get his beanie, and we'll cycle home together. So 4 o'clock comes and we're discharged, and I get my bike, and I start cycling home, and I catch up with Donal. And he's now wearing his beanie. A real stubborn character. So I'm thinking, what's going to happen now? He's going to go home. He's never in his life been separated from his beanie. Everybody's going to notice he's now wearing a beanie. What's his mother going to say? And how's he going to tell his mother? And what will his mother say to my mother? And so I'm freaking out. We managed to spend the night. I have no idea what happened. And nobody came to our front door. So the next day I go back to school, and it's been lashing rain all night. And I look over the wall, and there's this soggy mess. It looked like a kind of a saturated calico cat sitting down in the garden. And so I had to swallow my pride, climb over the wall, go down there, squeeze it out. There was like a gallon and a half of water in it, bring it up, put it into my satchel next to my math books. And then that evening, I began to cycle home. I can't present this. I'm not going to go up to their house and stick it through the letterbox, this soggy mass. I figure I'm going to have to dry it. Now, both of my parents work, so they're not at home. And my grandmother's making dinner for everybody, and there's always a turf fire in the sitting room. So I go over to the turf fire, and I squat beside it, and I'm wearing short trousers, and I put the beanie on my knee, and I'm holding it up to the fire to see if I can dry it out. And there's steam rising off it, and my shin is getting hot, so I have to change shins in order to kind of dry it. And there's steam coming off it, but it's not going fast enough. And I'm afraid that my grandmother's going to come in and say, whose beanie is that? And I'm going to have to say, it's Donal Crowley's beanie. And she's going to say, what are you doing with Donal Crowley's beanie? And then it'd be uproar. So I get a poker, and I put it on the end of the poker, holding it as near to the fire as possible to speed up the steaming process. And all of a sudden, I see not just white steam, I see black smoke coming as well. And I grab it, and there's a black scorch mark about this size on the beanie. Thinking, holy God, I'm in big trouble now. What am I going to do now? Now, the Christmas before, I'd been given a gift of a painting set, watercolors. Remember those things, these tin boxes, you open them out, and there's all these little squares of different colors and a long brush. And so I'm trying to match the color of the beanie against the colors here. And I dab it in, I'm stroking it, and by the time it's absorbed by the black scorch mark, it's a different color green. So I'm messing around with different greens to see if I can match the color. And it's not going fast enough, it's not absorbing, so I start pushing really hard, and all of a sudden the brush goes right through the beanie. And now I got a hole there as well. And for the life of me, I have no idea what the end of the story was. I'm dead serious. It's like PTSD set in, and I had to block it out. I have no idea what the sequelae were. Whether I gave it back, whether I kept it, whether Mrs. Crowley came to complain to my mother, whether my grandmother saw it, I have no idea what happened. Totally blanked out. Someday, when I grow up, I'm going to go to a hypnotherapist and ask them to hypnotize me and find out what the end of the story was. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I just compounded one error after the other. The solutions I had to the earlier problems created bigger and bigger problems. So I want to talk about that today. We'll talk about karma. So I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. The first one, I talk about the meaning and the purpose of karma. And then I want to talk about chaos theory, because I think chaos theory is very important in order to understand the subtler forms of karma. Then thirdly, I'm going to talk about the karma of codes of conduct. And then fourthly, I'm going to call it the FourFold Path. So they're the points I make this morning. So the first one, most of us think that karma is this esoteric Eastern belief system that we're punished in subsequent incarnations for sins we committed in previous incarnations. And that is not the meaning of karma whatsoever. Karma, in fact, is the single most important law of science. Karma simply means cause and consequence. And all of science is predicated on that model. I don't care what branch of science you're in, whether it's geology or physics or mathematics, it's always about determining, cause and correlation, or cause and kind of consequence. And so it's basically a mathematical scientific law as well as being a spiritual and a sociological law. A causes B. If you don't like B, stop doing A. C causes D. If you like D, keep doing C. So it's basically cause and effect. And I would say, to put it very, very pithily, that it consists of 3 pieces. That firstly, there's karma. Secondly, there's destiny. And thirdly, there's fate. And destiny and fate are very, very different, I believe. So karma is the realization that the hand you were born with is the hand you planned before you came in. You're not in this family by accident, or you weren't born into this nation by mistake, and you weren't born into this period of the 21st century by mistake. You planned in exquisite detail the people you were coming with, the family of which you would be a part, the culture you were born into, the country in which you lived, and the times in which you lived. So karma is that you planned a particular strategy because your soul was interested in a particular kind of growth for a particular incarnation. So there was karma. You came in with your karma, your plan of action. Your destiny then would be what you would look like at the end of your incarnation if you played your hand according to the way you planned to play your hand. So if you really fulfilled your mission, your destiny would be the aligned outcome of the way you played the hand that you planned through karma. Fate, on the other hand, is, what actually happens, because almost none of us play the hand the way we intended to play the hand. So instead of winding up with our destiny at the end of our lives, we wind up with our fate at the end of our lives. And there's a big gap often between the destiny and the fate. So fate is the result of non-aligned practice during incarnation. So nobody's going to blame us. We go back up with our heavenly mentors and we say, okay, that was your karma for this incarnation. That was the plan. This could have been the destiny if you had played it really, really well. You played it this way, and so this is your fate. So what do you need to do the next time you come in? So you plan your next hand. That's karma again. And that's basically, to wrap up what karma means, that's basically what it is. You plan your hand, but you can play your hand any way you want because you have free will. If you play it really well, you achieve your destiny. If you don't play it well, you wind up accepting your fate. And then you come back and you try to upgrade it a little bit. And we get as many lifetimes as we need in order to learn that the only thing that works ultimately is love. So that would be my first point. So my second point, I want to talk about chaos theory. And that seems like a very strange kind of conjunction, chaos theory and karma. But it's not, I believe. Because in order to understand the subtler aspects of karma, we need to understand chaos theory. Chaos theory was a mathematical model that arrived fairly recently, maybe 60, 70 years ago. And it basically says that tiny fluctuations in initial circumstances can lead to significant differences in final outcomes. It's the kind of the butterfly in Beijing model, that a butterfly beating its wings in Beijing can affect the weather patterns in San Francisco. And so it basically means, that tiny fluctuations in initial conditions cumulatively can lead to huge differences eventually. And it came out of originally when computers were invented, one of the first uses to which computers were put was trying to predict weather patterns. But it is notoriously difficult to predict weather because there are so many factors involved. There's air pressure involved, there's wind velocity and direction involved, there is topography, is it going over lakes or rivers or mountains or streams or deserts or whatever it is, there is temperature involved, there's humidity involved. So you have to factor all these things in and create an algorithm that tries to estimate what the weather is going to look like. And way back in the 40s, one guy working on a clunky computer, computers at that stage were bigger than a city block. I remember when I studied computers in the 1960s, our computer at the University College Cork was bigger than a city block. And you had to punch in these cards. You remember these cards? And even to solve a very simple problem would take hours and hours and hours of putting these cards through. So this weather scientist is trying to figure out, predict a weather pattern. And he puts in all the factors, and to be very accurate, he puts them into 4 or 5 decimal places. So instead of saying that the velocity where the wind was 50 miles an hour, he said 15.32654 miles per hour to get more and more accurate readings. So he put into 5 places of decimals each of the factors, and he estimated then, so the machine is chunking, and after about 8 hours, it delivers a verdict. And he wants to check the verdict. He's not really sure that this is really going to happen. So he puts the numbers back in again, but he truncates it and just does it to 4 places of decimals. For each factor, 4 places of decimals instead of 5. And after 4 or 5 hours, the results were radically different from the initial prediction. So that's what chaos theory is like. That small initial fluctuations can create huge differences eventually. And I'm going to use a few very simple metaphors. Imagine that you're a pilot and you want to fly from San Francisco, let's say, to Rome, Italy. And so you set your course, and it's basically about kind of get due east. So you set your course to go due east. But you didn't actually set it due east. You were 2 or 3 degrees north of east. What's going to happen? You're going to wind up in Oslo, Norway, instead of Rome, Italy. So a tiny little difference initially. You're not going to see it for the first 500 or 600 miles. By the time you get to Europe, it'll be vastly different. So what happens, of course, then is we apply this to life. We think that somehow that life is a linear process. And we think somehow that if we make even small mistakes initially, that we're destined to wind up in hell for all eternity. But gratefully, life is not a linear process. Life is much more like the trajectory through a spider's web or through a neuronal circuitry, where very, very frequently you reach nodal points where you can make slight shifts in direction. So let's say, for instance, that you're a pilot, you're leaving San Francisco, and your idea is to fly to Tokyo, which would due west. But you make a huge mistake, and you're actually flying east towards New York. Now, what are you going to do? Are you going to try to do the big kind of around shift, 180 degrees? There's a much simpler way. If you first make a slight little difference, instead of going east, you go east-southeast, and then another one at the next node, southeast, and then the next one, south-southeast, and then south, and then west-southeast, west, where am I going? West-southwest, and then southwest, and then west-southwest, and then west. And so finally, after making a whole bunch of little small changes, you're going in exactly the opposite direction. That, gratefully, is what life is like. We're not destined to kind of wind up in hell or in big trouble just because we made a mistake, even a big mistake initially. We can correct it every node we come to. And by node, I mean every relationship, every event in your life is an opportunity for making a little shift. And eventually, all these shifts wind up. So it's not that all the shifts lead to bad results. They can lead to very, very good results. But it depends on your mindset. I just imagine what would have happened to me if the Crowley family, had been out for a vendetta or revenge. They weren't. They were good friends of our family, and the 2 mothers were actually very, very close friends. But suppose that Mrs. Crowley had come down to Mrs. ÓLaoire and said, here's what Seán did. He ruined Donal's beanie. We want you to buy Donal a new beanie. And Peg says, budget is really, really tight, but she has to buy a new beanie. And then Mrs. Crowley decides she's going to really go for the jugular. She says, our son has been traumatized by this event. He's in PTSD. We're going to have to put him into weekly therapy, and you're going to have to pay for the therapy. At this stage, that would have broken the bank for Peg. So what would happen? I was in grade 4 at the time. I'd have to leave school and work in a fish and chip shop for the rest of my life. Never go to high school, never go to seminary, never get ordained, never go to Africa, never come to Palo Alto. So if Mrs. Crowley had taken just a few slightly different steps, I wouldn't be telling you about her son here today. And so that's how chaos theory becomes so important. It's like God has, GPS does not mean a global positioning satellite. It means God's protective system. So God is constantly offering us direction. We say to God, I want to go to heaven, whatever our version of heaven is. God says, okay, hang a left, on Channing. That's the first thing. Now, we're totally free to ignore everything God tells us or to misinterpret what God tells us. But God knows that ultimately you still want to go to heaven. And so no matter where you find yourself, however lost you are, God is going to give you the next direction that'll help to reorient you a little bit. So all you got to do is, at some stage of the game, maybe 45 incarnations down the road, to start listening to God's directions. And then you wind up where you want to be. So just even minor changes can actually add up to making significant changes eventually. That's my second point. My third point then, I want to talk about karma and codes of conduct. So the notion of karma is actually built in, everywhere you look it's built into it. They won't call it karma, but it's built into it. So if you look, for instance, at codes of conduct and what karma means there, the first thing you realize, if you do any reading, is that even Hindus, the vast majority of Hindus do not understand karma. They're the people who allegedly came up with the notion of karma, but the vast bulk of the people in the street do not understand what karma means. They think that karma is responsible for the caste system, are for transmigration of souls. So if you led really, really bad lives and you started out as a Brahmin, the top caste, you could wind up as an untouchable, 5 incarnations down the road. Or if you're really, really bad, you could wind up as an insect, or a lizard or something from being human. So this notion that God downgrades us constantly, and we get the karma we need, that's a misunderstanding of what karma really is. But there are lots of misunderstandings. Another great misunderstanding is that, karma can be achieved through vendetta, like the mafia or the McCoys and the Hatfields. So that, your great-great-great-grandfather killed my great-great-grandfather, and thereafter my grandfather killed your grandfather, and then your father killed my father, and now I'm going to kill you before you kill me. And so this vendetta is a form of karma, where you believe that you can right wrongs, by killing people who wronged you. And we find that all over, this notion of retribution. So that's a model of karma. We find it built into our justice system. We have, in the United States of America, if you're an American citizen, you are 7 times more likely to be incarcerated than if you were a Swedish citizen. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. So it's not justice for all, it's justice for some, and there are some people who are too big to jail. And so we got a justice system very, very often which discriminates, for various reasons. So that's another kind of an abuse of what karma looks like. We get an abuse where we think that, for instance, that rehabilitation is a mistake. Better to kind of punish people than to rehab people. And then we wind up with very vicious societies. We find it in the scriptures. In the Mosaic Code, we've had the phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, Moses allegedly, if he lived, I don't actually believe he was a real person, but allegedly he thrived about 1250 BCE. But actually that phrase is borrowed from the Code of Hammurabi, which was a Sumerian code of conduct from 1754 BCE, 500 years before Moses allegedly existed. That phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So there was a model, now it was an improvement on previous models of conduct. So what I was saying was that the punishment should be proportionate to the crime, an eye for an eye. You don't kill somebody who took an eye for an eye. But in actual fact, when you actually read through Torah, the 5 first books of the Hebrew Scriptures, there are about 50 different crimes that result in the death penalty. And almost none of them have to do with taking somebody else's life. Ridiculous things like failing to offer sacrifice, on a particular day. And so about 50 different crimes and a whole manner of ways of executing people. You could strangle them. You could kill them with a sword, kill them with fire, stone them to death, drown them. So all of these exquisite ways of punishing crimes, many death penalty for innocuous kinds of crimes. So even built into a system that claimed an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, it totally wildly exaggerated these things. And so here we have all over efforts to try to infuse karma into codes of conduct. So that's kind of like the downside of it, the bad side of it. Where are some of the systems that manage to get it right? So for instance, I've shared this story with you many times. There was a tribe in West Africa, and when a woman was about 8 months pregnant, the elders would sequester her in a tent or in a little cabin, and they would hypnotize her and put her into an altered state of consciousness. And then they would speak to the baby in utero, and they would believe that the mother's voice would be used by the baby to answer 2 questions. And the 2 questions were, what is your name? How do you want to be known? And secondly, what is your mission? What are you coming to do? And when the baby was actually being born, the women of the village would gather around the mother and the midwife, dancing around, reminding the baby who's being born of what his name is and what his mission is about. And if 15 years down the road, this kid was, guilty of some kind of antisocial behavior, they didn't lock him up and throw away the key. All of the people of the village gathered around him in a huge big circle, and he was put into the center, and they started chanting his name and chanting his mission, reminding him of how he had come. And typically within 5 or 6 minutes, the kid was on the ground, sobbing his eyes out, realizing that he'd blown his name and he'd blown his mission, and then he's reintegrated back into the group. So that's a totally different form of karma, where you reach out in love in order to try to teach somebody the error of their ways. Because reaching out in punishment obviously doesn't work. What's another model? The model proposed by Jesus of Nazareth, where he says, love your enemies. Forgiveness is what it's about. Now, forgiveness doesn't mean condoning a person's actions or even excusing their actions. It means understanding their actions. And when you understand why people are doing what they're doing, you have a totally different relationship. Then you can love them in an appropriate fashion. And I keep saying to you, there are 4 different ways to love somebody. The first one is confirmation. Attaboy, you're doing a great job. The second one is kind of complementarity, where you're team members and somebody makes a mistake and you pick up their mistake for them. The third one is compensation, where somebody is really not doing a great job and you try to make good for the sake of the team. And the fourth one is challenge or confrontation, where you tell somebody, that they're not doing well and they need to get their act together. And Christ would do this with the Pharisees. So loving somebody doesn't mean just accepting their behavior. Sometimes it means challenging their behavior. But it always has to come out of a place where you're understanding why they did what they did and you're trying to kind of ameliorate the whole situation, not exacerbate it by throwing gasoline on the fire. In Ireland, in ancient Celtic times, there was a beautiful system. We didn't have Roman law in Ireland. We had what was called the Brehon laws. And the Brehon laws were such that there was no crime which was punished by death, no matter what you did, even if you took another life. Capital punishment did not exist in the system. It was a system of compensation. You compensated the injured party for the crime you'd committed against them, even up to murder. And the compensation typically was through cattle. The medium of exchange was cattle. You had to pay somebody a particular head of cattle for particular kinds of crimes. And there were kind of lists of what crimes merited what kinds of compensation. But it was a situation in which capital punishment was not part of the equation. So this codes of conduct and very different kinds of codes of conduct. When you look, for instance, at the experience of the near-death experience, one of the beautiful parts of that is this life review, where you sit down with a mentor and you begin to look at your entire life, every event in your life. But not only from your perspective, but from the perspective of everybody involved in every incident of your life. So I'm just wondering at this stage, when my life review is ready, how am I going to handle the beanie incident? Because there's going to be my perspective, my mother's perspective, Mrs. Crowley's perspective, and Donal's perspective. I'm going to have to try to see this through 4 different perspectives. But I know I'm not going to be punished for it. I'm going to learn something from it. And so karma radically affects, the ways in which we do our codes of conduct. It's my third point. And the final point is this. I'm going to call it the FourFold Path. I think there are 4 simple ways in which we can optimize our practice of karma. And the first one is through our intentions. How serious am I about my life journey? How serious am I about becoming an enlightened being in an incarnation? So the intention I set, firstly, is really, really important. So most of us, we don't really set intentions. We're told, make more money, get a better job, marry the right person. But our intention around enlightenment, most of us don't have an intention about enlightenment. And so karma is more a question of luck of the draw. So the very first piece is setting the intention of, I want to become an enlightened being at some stage. Not so that I can kind of sit in a mountaintop, so that I can be full of love for everything. The second piece would be a commitment to the path. How seriously am I taking, my life's journey? I've set the intention, but how seriously am I taking it? It's like joining the gym on January 1st, setting the intention to really buff up during 2020, and then I never go to the gym. So what's my commitment? How serious am I about the journey? That's the second part of karma, thinks to me. The third part then is attention. So it's intention, commitment, attention. So attention is how well or how aware or how awake am I in the course of my life, so that I'm watching what's happening in my life and I'm making correlations and causation in my lifetime. So the attention I pay would be the third piece. And the fourth piece then would be the feedback mechanism. So how open am I to the messages that my actions and my thoughts and my words, are generating in the wider environment? How open am I to receiving kind of input? And I believe again that there may be 4 kinds of feedback. That the first kind of feedback is unsolicited feedback. Somebody gives you feedback that you didn't ask for and you don't like. Typically it'll be somebody who doesn't like you, but they'll give you feedback And sometimes there's a grain of truth. If 10 different people give you the same kind of feedback, even if 10 of them don't like you, there's probably a grain of truth someplace in it. So the first part would be unsolicited feedback, paying attention to that. The second piece would be solicited feedback, where you go on a semi-regular basis to, a friend or a therapist or a spiritual director, and you say, "Can you tell me, how I'm doing? What do you notice about me? Am I getting it right? Give me some feedback." And so you're soliciting feedback and integrating that into your subsequent performance. The third one would be spontaneous feedback. Something happens in your life, and it's kind of wake-up call, and there's nobody there pointing fingers to you or at you. You're thinking, "Wow, I wonder why that happened." But you're going to take the feedback from the output and see what you could do differently. And the fourth one is, deliberate, disciplined, regular self-feedback, where you set yourself a task. One of the things I love to do when I do weddings is to invite the young couple, to create a practice where at the end of each day, each person sits down, the husband and the wife separately, and each of them says, "With how much awareness did I live my marriage today? How much was I aware of my partner and their needs today?" So the Jesuits call this consciousness examine. It's not the examination of conscious. It's not saying which rules did I break, but with how much awareness did I live my day today. And so with those 4 guidelines, I think, basically, karma is an invitation into mindfulness and love. And in that way, in some senses, karma is the place where Jesus meets the Buddha. That the Buddha's shtick was living with awareness and mindfulness, and Christ's shtick was living in love and compassion. So if you wanted to put the Eightfold Path of Buddhism together with the 8 Beatitudes of Jesus, you got karma. Okay. So we'll open it up to questions now. Margaret.
It just occurred to me about the compensation with the cows. What if you don't have any?
If you're a Celt in Ireland and you didn't have cows, you weren't breathing. Literally. And the same thing was true in Kenya. The currency with the people I lived with, they were nomadic pastoralists, the currency was cattle. And so everything was paid for in cattle. So the Celts, that was their currency. It's not like there was farmers who had cows, and then there were people who lived in the cities, who did desk jobs. Everybody lived in the wilderness that was Ireland, and everybody had cattle. Everybody. And that was the way that you kind of traded. Even in Kenya, bride price. When a girl wanted to get married, the man's family had to pay dowry to the girl's family because they were losing a worker, and the men's family was gaining a worker, since women did most of the work in Kenya. And the medium of exchange was always either cattle, goats, or camels. It was always livestock. That's how dowry was paid. So it wouldn't have been a problem in Ireland of 500 BCE. Johanna.
Well, it's a really silly question, but where does spousal feedback come into?
I would say under unsolicited feedback.
There may be a grain of truth in there.
Right. So it's a very important question because it's the most significant relationship in everybody's life. Yeah. The thing is, there are ways of giving feedback. So where's the feedback coming from? Is it coming out of anger, and is it expressed, in 4-letter words, or is it a loving gesture? We're saying, "Sweetheart, I notice, when you do X, I feel Y." So there's a method of communication like nonviolent communication, where there's 4 stages to that process. Where the first thing is I make an observation. The second thing is I tell you how I feel because of what I observe. The third thing is I tell you what my general need is in this arena. And the fourth one is I make a specific, measurable, empirical request of you. So I'll give you a dumb example. You and I are driving together, John, in a car, and you're driving, and you're going, 85 miles an hour, and I'm scared inside in the car. And I said to you, "You're driving like a bloody mad woman." No, that's not an observation. That's a criticism and a judgment. If I say to you, "Joanna, you're driving at 85 miles an hour. I feel really scared driving at 85 miles an hour. What I need is to be able to relax in the car. So can you please get the needle down to 65? So that's a measurable request. If I say to you, "You're driving like a bloody madwoman. You drive safer." You say, "I am driving safely. I can drive safely at 85 miles an hour." And so the mode of communicating becomes very important. That is not a judgment, it's not an attack, it's not blame, it's an observation which both of us can verify. And I'm telling you how I feel, which is not to make you responsible. I say when I travel at 85 miles an hour, I feel really anxious. And what I need is to be able to relax in a car. And what I'm requesting is, please get the needle down to 65. We can both see whether it's going down or it's not. So if you're angry with me, you're going to press the accelerator and now you're doing 93 miles an hour. So spousal feedback largely is unsolicited, but it's actually, it could be a really, really good process to have an arrangement with your spouse, to invite on a regular basis, maybe once a month, to do a review of the relationship and say, can you tell me what you like about, how I've lived my marriage for this month and what didn't work for you? But to do it in a way that, is not an attack on you. I've invited to make it solicited instead of unsolicited and to couch it in language in which I'm not attacking you. Teresa.
I just said, I married a former Jesuit, and when we got married, he suggested that every week we sit down and talk about what went well this week and what didn't go so well.
Brilliant.
And what I feel about that is that it's just much more open and safe. It did end up helped us establish trust. And I also feel that in terms of our day, it's a much easier way to say, rather than condemning ourselves or whatever.
Absolutely.
And so anyway,
That's beautiful, Teresa.
for that.
Beautiful. It reminds me of when I was living in Kenya. I lived with nomadic pastoralists, but the government was trying to forcibly settle them into an agricultural lifestyle because it's very difficult to administer a mobile population. And so part of my job was to teach them basic agriculture. And so we opted for maize, planted maize. And when we were planting maize, a team of 4 people would go out together. And the first guy would have a stick, and he'd just jab a hole in the ground every 6 inches. The second guy would come along with a bag of maize seeds, kernels, and drop 2 seeds into each hole. The third guy, if they could afford it, but not all families could, would have a bag of artificial fertilizer, powdered fertilizer, and a spoon. And you take a spoon and put it into each hole. And the fourth guy would just cover up each hole, to just walk behind each other. And about, we got torrential rain for 2 months of the year, and then for 10 months of the year it was like 122 degrees Fahrenheit. And so all the rain happened in a very short period of time. So you get torrential rain, and after about, a month, the grain would be this high. And then they'd go out and they'd weed it. And after 2 months, it would be this high, and they'd weed it again, and then at 3 months, they'd harvest it. And so I'd bring these farmers in for sessions to try to find out, how are they doing. And for the first few years, I asked them, if you had to make a choice, you were only allowed to do one, you couldn't do both. You could either weed the maize or fertilize the maize, and you want to optimize your crop. Which is the more important, the weeding or the fertilizing? So initially, they were just guessing. After 2 or 3 years, they knew exactly. Weeding is far, far more important than fertilizing. Fertilizer is blind. You put fertilizer down, it's going to give growth to everything. Weeds, grasses, everything. You're going to have a jungle there. And so if you had to choose between them, weeding is more important. Now, I think that every one of us has both weeders and fertilizers in our lives. The weeders are the people who either we've solicited their feedback, or it's unsolicited, or they're parents to us, or spiritual directors, whatever they are. These are the people who help us to weed in our gardens. And the fertilizers are the people who love us unconditionally. If we only had unconditional love, we'd all become narcissists. If we only had weeders, we'd have total lack of self-esteem. So it's a balance between the weeders and the fertilizers in our lives. And we all plan, every incarnation, we plan people to come into our lives whose designated role is to be weeder. And then we meet these people and we're really upset with them. We call them enemies. What's wrong with that guy? That guy was there because you chose that guy to be there to weed in your patch.
When I was studying to give my talk on the Everyday Hero's journey, I thought, what is the journey? There's many initiations and activations, but the main thing I came down was just live your life, right? Yeah. Just live it. The good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful. It's the whole experience. Totally. And then it's like, appreciate it, and ultimately do something positive with it for yourself and others. And I've really learned a lot from people who've had NDEs.
Okay.
And I went to a recent talk in East Palo Alto. This woman had 4 NDEs. That's unusually high. And when she went to the other side, the main thing her guides were saying is pay attention to your intentions. They're very powerful. So every day, just have an intention to have a good day and, be of service and enjoy your day.
That's brilliant.
Then I went to this one guy who had 4 NDEs in the South Bay International Near-Death Association. 4 NDEs. The first one was a motorcycle accident. He had to rebuild his body because he wanted to live. So he studied all the mystics, and he went ahead and did the fasting, prayer, silence, nature, and music. He rebuilt his body. He came back with the message. He says, yes, we have many missions and agreements on this planet, but the number one is exactly what you say, spiritually wake up. And when you do that, help others to do it. But he said that was the overriding reason we're here.
That's brilliant, Ingrid. Beautiful. Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Pat. Jeff.
Yeah, you had mentioned the weeders and the fertilizers in your life, and then I was wondering how you relate that internally with awareness and sort of the inner critic.
Okay.
So, to some degree, at some point, the inner critic
That's
becomes...
brilliant. That's a very important connection, Jeff. So Jeff is asking about how you reconcile, the weeders in your life with the inner critic, the part of yourself that's constantly beating up on you anyway. So the first piece is, particularly when you get unsolicited feedback, is not just to accept that, their perspective is correct and fully accurate, and my perspective is wrong. It's a perspective, it's a viewpoint. And so I have to think, is there any value to it? So if I get unsolicited feedback that makes me feel less than I should be, it's not good feedback. So I would then go to somebody else, a friend of mine, somebody who knows me, and says, is this true? Do you see this in me as well? And somebody who knows you much better is able to much more accurately say, no, that guy has a problem. Something else going on there. And so there's this real dance between, letting in the criticism, because there may be some value in it, but not accepting it as the gospel just because somebody else said it. So making sure that I align it if it doesn't line up, with my previous self-image. If it doesn't line up with the feedback I've been getting from other people who know me a lot better and love me a lot deeper, then I have to say, okay, that was his viewpoint. I don't accept it, and I'm not going to build my self-image upon that kind of negative criticism. It was a very important point, Jeff, because there are people, who just self-flagellate. That very, very often we're actually more aware of negative feedback than we are of positive feedback, and we tend to form our self-image more on the negative stuff we get than the positive stuff we get. And the truth is, every single one of us is an eternal being, a child of God who was never born and can never die. We can have an incarnational beginning and an incarnational end, but the soul was never born and can never die. So you're pure love. You're trying to live that love in a very limited circumstance where you have a physical body, small little brain, you're subject to chronology and time, and you're still trying to live as lovingly as you can there. But to allow anybody to tell you that you're not a child of God, particularly fundamentalist religious people who tell you you're going to hell, or that only a select number of people are saved. You can no more be separated from the love of God than the ray of sunlight can be separated from the sun. You're an articulation of the divine. You cannot be separated from the source. Chris.
Yeah, I have kind of a cynical view of karma and so forth. I think, out of the Bible, Paul is quoted as saying, and I think you brought this up in one of the homilies, he was saying, why is it I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things I do want to do? And I just think the biggest hoax out there is that we have free will. I don't think we really have free will. I think it's all kind of a funny game going on. And I just see us as a bunch of robots. And if we look at our brain cells are composed of atoms, and then there's electrons, and they all move in a particular way, and they're going to cause certain decisions and so forth. And I don't know, I can't get a grasp on how we really have control. I think it's an illusion, a big illusion that we do have control, but we're really run by our programs.
So I would
And
respectively,
and I just
Okay.
don't.
okay, I would respectively disagree 180 degrees with you, Chris.
Yeah, okay.
Why are you in church this morning? There's some part of you that's trying to somehow, shift or move in some way. So let me address your question about the molecular activity of the neuronal brain. There's not a serious scientist out there today, particularly coming out of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics has shown us very, very definitely that consciousness is primary. And the reason that modern materialistic science is getting stuck down is they're attempting to make matter the core basis of everything else. Matter cannot be the core. Your body right now, Chris, if we were to take every cell in your body and reduce it out to its atomic structure, and take each atom of you and empty out all the space in your atoms are 99.9999% empty space. So if we took all the empty space out of Chris and everybody else in this room and every person on planet Earth, we'd be left with, as far as matter is concerned, a single grain of sand. If we did the same thing for all life forms on the planet, including the planet itself, the rock itself, and did the same thing and took the empty space out of each atom, we would have a single marble. The only reality we know, we can only perceive our perceptions. There's a famous fallacy in philosophy called the myth of the given. And the myth of the given says that, it is a fallacy to think that our sensorium and our cognitive processes are delivering us a one-to-one accurate map of what's out there. We have no idea what's out there. All you can say is when a particular sensorium engages with whatever is there, and a particular kind of black box tries to make sense of it, here's the images we come up with. They're created by your consciousness. There's never been a single poem written. There's never been a single mathematical algorithm devised which did not come out of human consciousness. The psyche is the source of everything. So Carl Jung said it very famously. He was very, very good friends with a very famous physicist, a guy called Wolfgang Pauli, who had a Nobel Prize in physics. And they corresponded for years and years and years. And Jung said famously, atoms and archetypes have this in common. They cannot be directly observed. They can only be inferred from their effects. So you can't even establish that matter exists. All you have is your perception of matter. This thing here that I think is solid is not solid. It's just a frequency which is different from the frequency of my knuckle. But if I could change my frequency, I could put my hand right through this because it's not solid. It's 99.999%. So as far as free will is concerned, if we don't have free will, we're robots. And if we're robots, then we can't be responsible for any crimes we commit or any achievements we make. We cannot be in love with people. We cannot recognize beauty. We cannot recognize truth without free will. I agree with you that we don't perhaps have as much free will as we would like. We think we have, because there is some, our environment is a part. There's a great model created by a guy called Ken Wilber. He's a very famous American philosopher, and it's called the four quadrants model. And if you imagine a window with 4 panes of glass, so there's 2 columns and 2 rows. And the one column is the inside, the other column is the outside, the first row is the self, and the second row is the community. And then you look at how they intersect. The top one up here is the inside of the individual, that's your mind. The top one up here is the outside of the individual, that's your physical brain. The bottom on the left is the inside of the group, that's the culture. And the bottom on the right is the outside of the culture, that's the infrastructure. So any consideration has to take these 4 pieces into it. When you're thinking about an action you made, a crime you committed, something you created, all these 4 aspects have to be weighted. It's an algorithm with 4 factors, and they're going to be weighted differently depending on what the outcome is. But so in some senses, if you were beaten up as a little child, if your mother, for instance, suffered from, fetal alcohol syndrome, she's on drugs or alcohol when the baby is in utero, and the child's brain is scrambled, now that's a factor. How much free will does that child have to exercise over moral decisions? If somebody has been in an environment, where in order to get to school, they had to pass through a metal detector because there's so much violence in it, how much free will is that person? But there is free will there. It's a question of how much and in what circumstances.
I'm just going to say it's interesting, but from my own observation, my own life, and watching other people, everything's really predictable. I mean, I know I can't do certain things, and I want to do them. And I see everybody else seems to have a similar problem.
So
You
you're
can't
going to have to
just-
figure out. You're going to have to figure out for yourself, Chris, why you're having this experience. I can't tell you why you're having it. I can surmise. I can come up with theories, but I can't tell you that this theory is true. You're going to have to do that for yourself. And if you want to have a different experience in life, you're going to have to do something different. You're going to have to shift something. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in this modality. I've heard you ask this question probably 9 or 10 times over the last several years. If you want to shift Chris, you've got to shift Chris. I can't shift Chris. If you want to be the way you are and you're happy with it, okay. If you want to believe that you have no free will and that you're happy to settle there, that will be your experience. If you want to have a different experience, you're going to have to think differently. And it's going to be strange initially, but only you can do it for Chris. I can't do it for you.
Yeah, it's kind of a deep subject, but
Yeah, it is.
I respectfully disagree with you.
That's fine. That's fine. Max.
A question about the destiny and the fate.
Fate.
You spoke briefly in your last sermon about that there was no color. And then suddenly there's this evolution and we have this ability to detect the electromagnetic field of color. And so in a similar way, when we have this GPS guiding us to help us align our lives or our actions and choices with our highest intentions, what can help that spiritual evolution? So if we're stuck in this place where we are mechanic, that we can suddenly start evolving and seeing these options and choices and make decisions that are healthier.
Great. That's a great question, Max. So how do we move? So one of the things when we study the great spiritual traditions, there are particular kinds of practices which are true and tried. So just as surely as, in my opinion, there is a science of spirituality and there's a spirituality of science, that the really great scientists at the beginning of the 20th century, Max Planck, Erwin Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, Niels Bohr, John Archibald Wheeler, they were all mystics. They were more fascinated by the metaphysical repercussions of their mathematical algorithms than they were by the mathematics themselves. So they were mystics. I coined a phrase years ago. I called them mysticists, a cross between a mystic and a scientist. A scientist who has mystical experiences, or a mystic who has scientific, training in some way. So there's a science to spirituality as much, as there is a science to physics or a science to mathematics. And it goes like this. Every scientist starts off by making observations in her field, whether her field is geography or, paleontology or physics or whatever. You start with a bunch of observations in the field. Then you begin to think you're recognizing some kind of a pattern in your data, stage 2. Stage 3 is you come up with some kind of a hypothesis to explain the apparent pattern. Stage 4 is you set up an experiment to test your hypothesis. If it proves accurate, you're going to have to replicate it in somebody else's laboratory because it could just be a statistical fluke. So you get somebody else to replicate it. They find their same result. Now you got a scientific principle. You put a bunch of scientific principles together and you've got a scientific model of the field. But at some stage, new anomalous data are bound to present themselves. And now you have to tweak the existing model to accommodate the new data. And at some stage, so many new anomalous data present themselves that the old model is radically inadequate, and you've got to kind of create a brand new model that can accommodate all the old data and the new data. And that happened just twice in the 20th century, with relativity theory in 1915 and with quantum mechanical theory in the 1920s, where the old Newtonian model was radically inadequate. So the very, very same thing happens in spirituality. You look at all the mystics from all the traditions, whether they're Sufis or Buddhists or Hindus or Christians. They make observations. They go into the desert, they make observations of what it's like to be alone in your own mind. They begin to see patterns emerging. They then set up a hypothesis. I wonder if this is happening because... So we set up an experiment. I do more of the same. I do more and more meditation, for instance, and I find that I have more peace, or there's more compassion in my life. I now check it out with Bernadette, a fellow mystic who lives, in the next cave over. And I ask Bernadette, what do you do? And she explains to me the kind of meditation she's doing. And I say, what kind of results are you getting? And she says, well, I feel more grounded. I feel more compassionate. I feel at this stage I don't have any prejudices left. I say, wow, now we've established a principle. Now we begin to build a model. Now at some stage, maybe new experiences present new data. But what I'm emphasizing is it's a radically scientific model, spirituality is. So you then have to scour the literature, the mystical literature, to find out what are the practices that these people engage in and have engaged in, for thousands of years, that allow them to experience unity consciousness or encounters with the divine or angelic presences. And then try those for yourself. Be empirical. Test them out. If they work, adopt them. If they don't work, try something else.
A follow-up?
Sure.
So using nonviolent communication in a way,
Yes.
the understanding, so the perspective of what you had, your friend had, your mom had, or his mom had, and zooming out and saying, if the intention is for me to be as loving as possible, so I'm trying to understand how this was not, and then I can test all these hypotheses. But trying to get into the lens of God of saying, I was intended to be as loving as possible here, so what would be that action? And then trial and error, seeing a technique emerge from that.
Absolutely, because God is the only person who's able to multi-perspective. God is the only person with all the perspectives, because everything that exists is simply God in drag. Every mountain, every oak tree, every human being is another articulation of the divine with the purpose of generating experiences. So God is the one who experiences all that can be experienced. And we are the eyes and the ears that allow those experiences for God to happen, that we can benefit from it. It's not that we're just feeding all the data back to God. It's that we're benefiting from the experience ourselves. So, for instance, if you live by a river and the river is coming through your property and you're using it to kind of water your land or drive a mill to grind corn, you can do that, but you don't own the water, you don't own the river. The river has to pass back to the ocean. The river belongs to the ocean. So the river will eventually disgorge all its contents to the ocean, but in the process, it's helped you to live. And that's what God is doing. God is not just generating experiences for herself, she's also having the experiencers benefit from what's flowing through them. Jay.
As I've gone along, gotten older in life, starting at probably around the age 30, I became very much an empiricist in terms of my spirit. And the first thing I noticed is these weird coincidences would happen, and they always guided me. And after a while, I realized it would be unscientific not to accept that there's something really going on here. Then I expanded on that, and I thought, well, this suggests that there must be some sort of intelligence or spiritual overarching being. We can call it God or whatever name we want, I suppose. Mm-hmm. So, and I thought, well, boy, that makes sense. Then I started noticing, and this was just a few years ago, I started to realize most of these synchronicities, to get back to Jung, were happening to keep me on my path, on the thing that apparently I agreed on, or I'm not sure about that, but that it was either to keep me on the path or give me the tools I needed to be on it or give me some guidance while on it. So anyways, my path, as best I can see, is to learn as much as I can about myself and grow and heal, to learn all the psychology and spirituality related to that, and then communicate it to others, which I love doing. What I notice is none of this required any commitment. It's just what I love. It's a passion. Now, and here there's a question in here. Part of what I need to do, and I was successful and then went on several trips and gained all the weight back, I need to lose weight. Because having a stomach like this, which is not too bad, but it's less healthy. But I need to live for a while to complete my goal. Why, with using your 4 steps, why am I not succeeding in that? You know what I mean? Where am I going awry? Whereas the first part, it just seems like there's no, my goal, my mission, it seems like there's nothing I need to do. It's just who I am. But losing weight doesn't seem to be who I am. So what can I do to make that happen? How can I make it maybe even a passion?
So we have to be very, very careful, that in this spiritual journey, and this is not just to you, just to me and to everybody, we have to make sure that the ego is always prepared to hijack any successful enterprise in order to get out in front and lead it. The ego is like a politician. Politicians rarely come up with good ideas. But when somebody has a good idea, some politician is going to claim it and get out in front of it and pretend to lead it. So even in the spiritual journey, the ego is very happy to get in front of the enterprise, and create the agenda and the timeline and the modality. So we have to realize that this is God's game. Lila is God's game. And so it has to be in God's time And in God's way, I can do everything I'm capable of doing, but I don't know all I don't know all the factors involved in the equation. It may well be that, in your instance here, that the weight issue is also a teaching technique whose importance you may not realize until much later. You have no idea what it's going to teach you. It may not even be in this lifetime. So we have to be really, really careful that when we set out on our mission and we commit ourselves to trying being in alignment with the purpose for which we came, none of us knows all of the details of that purpose, and we have no idea what hidden treasures lie in the apparent problems we're experiencing. So the ability just to kind of do what I can do, and then allow God to determine the timing and the modality of the enterprise. Yeah. So guys, thank you so much for your patience. Right. So before we continue with our Eucharist, let's offer each other a sign of our peace.